Hi, I'm Greg Hunter, and this is the weekly news wrap-up for July 27, 2012. Listen, I'm not going to talk too much about the Aurora shooter, the Batman shooter. Now it's morphed into a stone-cold assault on the Second Amendment, which is a big story, but I don't want to talk a lot about it. You've been talked to death about it. I think there are other bigger stories. I think the Aurora thing's kind of a sideline, especially when we consider what's going on in the Middle East that could lead to a world war and the financial meltdown of the Western world financial system. So, not talking a lot about the Aurora shooter. I'm sure you're sick of it, as I am as well. So, my first story is Syria. And Syria is on top again because Russia is involved. I told you last week they were sending a large contingent of ships to the Syrian coast. Now the word has it that they're sending a large contingent of Marines to sit off the Syrian coast. So if the Assad regime needs them, they can go in and help prop them up. This is a big deal. I told you that the Russians have a naval base on the coast of Syria in Tartus, and that the Russians have drawn a line in the sand and saying this is not going to go down the way Libya went down. We're not going to do it. We're not going to allow the West to do it. You've also heard about the Syrians threatening to use their chemical weapons. Now, people most involved, Israel, Jordan, Turkey, they are involved. They border Syria. And so they're worried about this whole mess. Now we hear that Iran has also said they're going to support Syria militarily if they need to. Can you see what kind of a mess this is shaping up as? This is a civil war that's claimed the lives of nearly 20,000 Syrians. And it could touch off World War III. And listen, I am not being overly hyping this. This is a very, very dangerous situation. I have a friend of mine who speaks Farsi, who's now a U.S. citizen. He grew up in Iran, and he said he thinks that there's no way that Iran can be attacked until they take out Syria. And maybe the Russians think the same thing. They're sending ships, they're sending Marines, they're sending attack helicopters. This doesn't look like a small little military exercise. It looks like that, hey, listen, this is the line in the sand. You're not knocking out Syria. You're not knocking out Assad. It's a very dicey situation. You should watch it. Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner this week was testifying in front of Congress, and boy, he had to fend off some real barbs, especially from Republican House members as to, hey, why didn't you stop this LIBOR rigging fraud? It's trillions of dollars of interest rates are set off LIBOR, as much as 800 trillion. The liability to the banks is going to be enormous in the trillions of dollars, even if it's 1/10 of 1% that they'd have to be liable for. Tim Geithner said, hey, well, I told the regulators. What? Tim, Mr. Geithner, you were at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. You were the regulator. And the bankers are going to say, well, we talked to Geithner about it, and, he didn't say anything, and he gave us his tacit approval. We didn't want to break the law. We didn't want to commit fraud. And, we all heard that we had to do this to save the economy, so we didn't think it was fraudulent. Look for Timothy Geithner to be sacrificed by the big, real money people before this is all over. I think he's in big, big trouble. I think his career is over, and I think he's in big trouble. Next up, the former CEO of Citigroup, Sandy Weil, he basically pushed this too big to fail supermarket model. He and a group of other of his weasel banker friends, got behind the Graham-Bliley-Leach Act, financial innovation that did away with Glass-Steagall in 1999. Republicans, Democrats, Bill Clinton signed it, the president in 1999. Oh, yeah, financial innovation. Well, it turned out to be financial poison. Glass-Steagall was basically thrown out. We no longer had a firm wall between investment banks and commercial banks. And when this thing blew up in 2007 and 2008, whoops. Well, if we had Glass-Steagall, they'd have gone bankrupt. That's what should have happened. They should have gone bankrupt. It would have been tough, but we'd be on our way out of this by now. But instead, the line was blurry. They got bailed out. Now Sandy Weil is saying, wow, we got to break up these banks. What? Now we ought to break these banks up? Thank you, Mr. Weasel Weil. I think we've had enough of your suggestions being your big suggestion to make supermarket banks too big to fail has just imperiled the world financial system, and it's still imperiled. And here's what I think is going to happen too. Where they're going to separate the commercial banks and and the investment banks, new investment banks. They'll strip out all the good assets out of the banks they have now and put them in new investment banks, and they'll leave us taxpayers with all the toxic mortgages, the phony accounting, and insolvent big carcasses of these too big to fail banks, which are really basically are already mostly, or if not completely, insolvent. They'll sail away and whoa, I guess that was a bad idea. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Weasel Sandy Weil. Yeah, thanks for your input and your contribution to society. Next up, a guy who's not a weasel, Ron Paul, and he got his audit the Fed bill through the House of Representatives. Pretty big margin, 327 to 98. I think that there's a lot of Democrats that jumped on that wagon train because if this thing blows up, they better be on the side of auditing the Fed. Now, the next step is the U.S. Senate. Harry Reid, who is in charge of the Senate, who is in the majority party in the Senate, Democrats. I don't know if he can control all of his Democratic senators who may also jump on that bandwagon. They're not stupid. They know the economy's in trouble. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of this when it blows up, which would mean if the bill passes the House and the Senate and it lands on President Obama's desk, what do you bet, because he got a lot of campaign contributions from Wall Street banks, what do you bet he vetoes it? And isn't that going to be a sticky wicket even before or after the election? And a lot of people I talked to, including Carl Denninger, thinks, I think it'll blow up before the election. We shall see. Next up, have you ever wondered how a bank like MF Global goes under with a big giant question mark of 1.6 billion of client money, poof, vaporized? Well, it came out this week that the law firm of MF Global is none other than the former law firm of Attorney General Eric Holder. Big story on the site. Lots of other insider, junk going on and stuff where people really aren't doing their job and they are compromised, I think. We have become a nation of men and not a nation of laws, and that's a sad statement about what's going on. Next up, did you think that your news is not censored? Well, think again. According to a New York Times article that came out a couple of weeks ago that came to my attention, it was on the opinion pages. Basically, the New York Times said that most big mainstream news organizations allow quotes to be censored by the Obama campaign and the Romney campaign. They allow it. They allow them to be approved. I call that censorship. Can you believe that? And this includes the New York Times, the people who wrote the article. It's on the website, usawatchdog.com. It's on there. Can you believe? At least the New York Times, somebody at the New York Times had the guts to put that out there. That's not journalism. Listen, if some campaign doesn't want to talk to you, you hire your reporters and you basically fund them to follow them around and, quote, write everything down that they say. And you do stories that way. And you make it a big deal. They say, hey, they wanted to approve us to approve quotes. We're not going to do that. But no. Even the New York Times is knuckling under. And you wonder why sites like this and many others are growing while the mainstream media is steadily shrinking. They can't shrink fast enough, in my humble opinion. Finally, Penn State, big fines and big judgments were handed down against Penn State, but they didn't shut the football program down, which they call that the death penalty. It was a fate worse than death. Really? Plenty of people thought it should have been shut down at least for a year. That's the death penalty. And so my question is this. Higher ups at Penn State knew about the rape of children, some of them in the locker room at Penn State, and that doesn't get you the death penalty? What do you have to do to get the death penalty? That's the way I see it. Thank you for supporting usawatchdog.com.